Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In part 2 of this presentation, we continue our discussion of the fascinating Saturnian moon Enceladus. In part 1, we outlined numerous mysteries that the moon continues to pose to planetary scientists. One of these mysteries was the unanswered question of why the highly energetic plumes of Enceladus have yet to disturb the moon's nearly perfect orbit. The answer to this mystery may be found in an equally fascinating puzzle: the astonishing peaks recently observed in Saturn's rings.
These jets coming off of Enceladus are escaping the moon and forming a ring around Saturn. So we know they leave at a high speed. It's something like a rocket engine in the way that they work, which should be disturbing the orbit, but it's not. So something must be restoring that orbit or preventing it from being disturbed. Now, if it's a geyser acting like a rocket engine, it's improbable to the point of being impossible that those multiply firing rocket engines of Enceladus could be acting in such a way as to maintain a perfect orbit. Enceladus orbits a little ways outside of Saturn's rings, and right there in those rings we can see such a damping force at work. We have many pictures shot on location, movies shot on location by Cassini, of disturbances in the rings. On many occasions, structures pop up out of the rings and rise up for a kilometer or two, and then drop right back down within a few degrees of orbit. Or waves form in the rings, they say by the shepherd moons going by. But if you look at these waves, you'll see that within just a few degrees of orbit after the moon has passed them, they've already flattened right back down. And that is in complete an abject defiance of the laws of gravity. If the moon was the only thing disturbing the particles and causing those waves, when they rose up, they should not have come back down into the ring plane until 90 degrees of orbit away. And then 180 degrees away, they would have been evident on the other side going downward. And then 90 degrees further, they would have been flat again. So it would have been this constant oscillating disturbance if it was only caused by gravity. But something else is damping them out, and you can see it in the pictures.
Insight into the electrical Saturnian environment may have been provided by the experimental work of the scientific pioneer Christian Birkeland.
Christian Birkeland did this experiment over 100 years ago. In his Torella, he reproduced Saturn's rings. And operating under purely electrodynamic forces, he got a structure we can't tell until we reproduce it, but looks as flat as Saturn's rings. And we know that gravity isn't involved particularly because it's not in orbit about a gravitating body. It's rings forming around a charged sphere. So right there we already have an example of an electrodynamic damping force that forces those glowing particles to orbit in a planar ring and not leave it. And if you can imagine, if you reached in with your finger there and disturbed those little particles, they would come right back down, just as the waves in Saturn's ring do.
In 2011, scientists reported the surprising discovery of salt grains in the Enceladus plumes. This discovery is consistent with the theory that the plumes are electric discharge phenomena.
There is another experiment that we can do. We can compare the two theories of the icy jets of Enceladus side by side in the same laboratory right here on Earth, even using most of the same equipment. Simply take a ball of slightly salty ice and freeze a little cartridge heater into it, and then cool it down to liquid nitrogen temperatures and put it in a vacuum chamber. Now turn that heater up a little bit so it rises above the temperature of liquid nitrogen by maybe 80 degrees Kelvin, and see if you see any ice geysers coming off of that ball of ice. Personally, I don't think you will, because if you would, we would have already known. The refrigeration people would have told us about that long ago, because that would make a good refrigeration mechanism. You could patent that. So that's one experiment. The external electrical hypothesis would use the very same slightly salty ball of ice, cooled down to liquid nitrogen temperatures, put it in the vacuum chamber, only this time the stand we put it on would be one of the electrodes, and a second electrode would be in the chamber, just as Birkeland did in his Torella. Turn the voltage up between the icy ball and the external electrode and look for electrical erosion processes on that icy ball, which is slightly conductive because it's salty. So in 2006, I proposed this experiment to put this slightly salty ball of ice into a vacuum chamber and look for electric discharge. And one of the things I said is that the tiger stripe area should be concentrating the salts and becoming more conductive, and that would then draw the discharge to that area in a self-reinforcing process. Cassini confirmed that indeed Enceladus is slightly salty. So this is an electric universe prediction made in 2006 by myself, and I believe also by Walt Thornhill, that 6 years later was confirmed. And we both suggested that the tiger stripes would have an enhanced conductivity. This we can look for in the lab as well. See if the electric discharges concentrate the saltiness where the discharge is coming from. And I'll go on and even say even further that I'm not so sure that there's any feature on Enceladus that we cannot replicate in the lab.
Despite the theoretical differences between conventional astronomy and the electric universe, NASA scientists do now acknowledge the electrical circuit between Saturn and Enceladus.
Another feature discovered not too many years ago is that Enceladus is leaving its footprint on Saturn as it orbits about it. Below the aurora, in the high latitudes, is the signs of an electric discharge in Saturn that follows Enceladus around in its orbit. Just as on Jupiter, Io and other moons are leaving electrical signatures in the auroral regions of that planet. Even NASA has acknowledged that this is an electrical circuit connecting the icy moon Enceladus with the planet Saturn. So this is another example of why Enceladus is such a beautiful laboratory experiment. The magnetosphere of Saturn is acting like a giant mass spectrometer. The way a mass spectrometer works is that the particles coming into it get diverted according to their charge to mass ratio. They discovered last year, as Cassini swept through the plume that's coming off of Enceladus, the icy particles that make up that plume have different charges on them. Some are positive and some are negative, and they come in different ratios.
In forthcoming episodes, we will continue to elaborate the evidence for planetary science in an electric universe. From the electric discharges on the surface of the Jovian moon Io, to the astonishing double vortices at the south pole of Venus, to the incredible electrical forces driving the Martian atmosphere, and even the electrical nature of our own planet's weather and geological processes. The predictive successes of the electric universe theory become more difficult for mainstream science to ignore. For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.